I'm sometimes asked what I think the real difference is between the alt-left and the mainstream regressive left dominant today. For many, it's that the alt-left rejects identity politics in favor of economics and class realism. While true and relevant, I don't think that's what the real core difference is. What I've noticed is that the alt-left is made up of left-wing objectivists. Now, what do I mean by this? For a definition of objectivism, I'll refer to the philosophy's mid to late 20th century standard-bearer to define the term. The Ayn Rand lexicon writes, "My philosophy, objectivism, holds that reality exists as an objective absolute. Facts are facts, independent of man's feelings, wishes, hopes, or fears. Reason, the faculty which identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses, is man's only means of perceiving reality, his only source of knowledge, his only guide to action, and his basic means of survival. Man, every man, is an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. He must exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others, nor sacrificing others to himself. The pursuit of his own rational self-interest and his own happiness is the highest moral purpose of his life." So far so good, I think. While I doubt agreement would be universal, especially in how far to go with core objectivism and where to concede that sometimes perception and morality are subjective, I'd suspect that most alt-leftists have these kinds of enlightenment humanism-based ideals. Where we differ from Rand is in the fourth critical point of her philosophy. The ideal political system is laissez-faire capitalism. It is a system where men deal with one another not as victims and executioners, nor as masters and slaves, but as traders, by free and voluntary exchange to mutual benefit. It is a system where no man may obtain any values from others by resorting to physical force, and no man may initiate the use of physical force against others. The government acts only as a policeman that protects man's rights. It uses physical force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use, such as criminals or foreign invaders. In a system of full capitalism, there should be, but historically has not yet been, a complete separation of state and economics, in the same way and for the same reasons as the separation of state and church. Well, this is obviously going to be a problem. We are leftists after all, so this has caused a lot of disdain towards Ayn Rand among leftists. But I wonder how many leftists could really pinpoint exactly what it is they don't like about it. As an alt-leftist deeply steeped in Marxist materialism, the problem here is obvious to me. Rand describes here an ideal state, one in which a relatively even distribution of capital, or ownership of the means of production, enables all people to engage in free trade on relatively even terms. This is not how it is. When productive assets, capital, are highly concentrated into relatively few hands, and the majority have only their own labor to sell as a means of making ends meet, unless they can gain access to capital or some other competitive advantage somehow. The trading here may be free in theory, but in practice, the differences in bargaining power may make the end result scarcely distinguishable from a master-slave situation. As evidence of this, observe any sweatshop anywhere in the world. Further, there's no real getting away from this. Economic production is a social endeavor. It is impossible to extricate oneself from the surrounding economy entirely. You probably won't live long, assuming you don't run afoul of the law and get arrested somehow. And what kind of idiot would really consider participation in productive activity entirely voluntary in any event? If you really believe economic activity to be truly voluntary, try going without the necessities of life even for a short time and see how far you get. Note that the problem here is not with the concept of a system where men deal with one another not as victims and executioners, nor as masters and slaves, but as traders by free and voluntary exchange for mutual benefit. This is a good and ideal system. The problem with Rand's objectivism is that laissez-faire capitalism isn't that system. The idea that it could be, if you have a mass concentration of productive capital in some hands and a mass concentration of hunger in others, makes a mockery of every decent concept outlined in Rand's whole description, a mockery that nevertheless serves powerful interests well, and therefore remains a mockery that is widely taken seriously. The issue that the alt-left has with the regressive left lies in the latter's rejection of all of the above. In large measure, it's because primary disagreement between regressive leftism and Rand's objectivism isn't over the fourth point, but rather with the first two. Modern regressive leftism wouldn't think of itself as being modern. They are postmodern, which is the key difference, and also where the alt-left and the regressive left also disagree. Postmodernism is not an easy concept to pin down. Postmodern scholarship is notoriously abstract, impenetrable, and jargon-laden. Wikipedia defines it as being, quote, defined by an attitude of skepticism or distrust towards grand narratives, ideologies, and various tenets of Enlightenment rationality, including the existence of objective reality and absolute truth, as well as notions of rationality, human nature, and progress. Instead, it asserts that knowledge and truth are the product of unique systems of social, historical, or political discourse and interpretation, and are therefore contextual and constructed to varying degrees. Accordingly, postmodern thought is broadly characterized by tendencies to epistemological and moral relativism, pluralism, self-referentiality, and irony. In short, extreme cultural relativism. And this relativism doesn't just apply to morality, but to the very foundations of philosophy itself. Metaphysics, the nature of reality, and epistemology, basic theory surrounding man's means of acquiring knowledge, are assumed to be socially constructed and therefore likely to vary by culture, according to each culture's own unique history and characteristics. I should say, first of all, that I do think there's something to be said for some of postmodernism's influential principles. Some aspects of postmodernism, such as its rejection of notions of absolute truth, seem calculated to ensure that people remain intellectually humble. A worthwhile endeavor, though I doubt this is the best way to go about it. Postmodern philosopher Jacques Derrida's theory of deconstruction in particular, with its challenge that we dismantle our excessive loyalty to any idea by striving to see where the opposed idea might have a point, does resonate with me. Postmodernism, like its relative critical theory, was originally born of a distrust of dogmatic and Manichaean historical narratives, the kind that underlie totalitarian and fundamentalist belief systems. This is a distrust I share. But if we are to hold these kinds of post-structuralist lines of reasoning up against their own forms of textual analysis, we find that they too collapse under the weight of their own systems of deconstruction. Who deconstructs the deconstructionists, after all? Early postmodernism seemed aware of this, and so was marked by a sense of irony. More importantly, however, the notion that text had no inherent meaning, or that there was no objective means of contrasting the merits of some cultures or societies with others, left the academic defenders of the Western intellectual tradition in a moribund state. This would therefore make them easy to displace by those who had a greater will to power than they did, which was just about anybody. Postmodernism emerged in academic life around the same time as identity politics did, and the two did seem to complement one another. Derrida observed that the binary opposites that serve to reveal meaning in text had a strong tendency to privilege one side of the equation over the other, such as the privileging of the masculine over the feminine as an example. This dovetailed nicely with the emergence of feminist theory. and so deconstruction, critical theory, postmodernism, leftist identity politics, and the surviving remnants of Marxism began to reinforce one another, but not always in a good way, and as time went on, in an increasingly toxic way. The notion that truth and the means by which people discovered truth were subjective and socially constructed was gradually wed to identitarian theories based on race and gender modeled after Marxism. Quietly abandoned was Marxism's insistence that class hierarchy was material in nature and dependent on relations of production. Also quietly abandoned was postmodernism's distrust of the grand narrative. Quasi-postmodernist rationalizations were advanced to place feminist theory and other schools of thought aimed at liberating so-called marginalized peoples beyond the reach of the kinds of criticism and deconstruction that they subjected mainstream academic thought to. It was racist, they argued, for whites to argue with critical race theory, for it was necessary for marginalized people of color to develop their sense of social consciousness in the absence of white meddling. The only motive white people could possibly have in such an endeavor would be to defend and reinforce their privilege, after all. That sounds like one hell of a grand narrative they've put together up there in the ivory tower. And with bodies of philosophy initially contrived by a bunch of white males, for the most part, and in academic institutions created and developed almost exclusively by white males. Indeed, the very notion that racial and gender equality are themselves good things and worth pursuing are deeply rooted in the principles of the very rationalist objectivism that these latter-day critical theorists condemn as racist and sexist constructs. But don't go deconstructing that now. You'd probably get kicked out of the academy for hate speech. While we are expected to believe that truth is socially and culturally constructed, there's no objective way to determine that one identity is superior to another. Funny how quickly the dictates of the Black Studies Department or Women's Studies Departments regarding what is and is not racist or sexist are not themselves relative, not themselves socially constructed, not themselves based in rootless systems of textual or visual interpretation that admit themselves to be no less infallible than the works they deconstruct, not themselves rooted in binaries that arbitrarily privilege one side over another. No, none of that, but rather are timeless and eternal truths, and irrefutable moral commandments binding on all, past, present, and future, nothing less than the equivalent to the very word of God. This is what gives rise to the most aggravating aspects of dealing with the social justice warrior. They feel entirely and completely legitimate in dismissing counter-arguments based on the socially constructed identities of the persons making those counter-arguments, because they've cherry-picked postmodern philosophy to give themselves license to claim both that truth is relative, socially constructed, and without an objective basis on the one hand, and that claims made by members of marginalized groups regarding their oppression are indeed absolute, infallible, unquestionable, and universal axioms binding upon all, on the other hand, and with none of the irony characteristic of postmodernism. Fortunately, the alt-left is having none of this. The alt-left is, if anything, definable as a reunion of the left with the principles of the Enlightenment. The historical sins of Western civilization, patriarchy, and capitalism were not caused by Enlightenment values, but by an abandonment of those values. The values of equality in the eyes of God, or equality before the law for those of a more secular bent, were what was violated by the transatlantic slave trade, Native American genocide, colonialism, and fascism, among others. It was due to the liberal Enlightenment that Western civilization had been able to pause and reflect upon its historical sins and take steps to remedy them. The fear I have is that in the process of doing so, Western Christendom has lost confidence in itself and opened the door for anti-Enlightenment ways of thinking, such as fundamentalism, fascism, and regressive leftism to become mainstream. The task of the alt-left, as I think, should be to rescue objectivist principles from the laissez-faire capitalists and uphold those principles against their opponents to the right and to the left. This has been Agent Kami, over and out.